What happens when a prince finally hears the word no? Not from the media, not from critics, not from strangers online, but from his own father. Imagine this for a moment. A man born into one of the most powerful institutions on earth. A man whose phone calls were once answered before the first ring finished vibrating. A man who never had to ask how much something cost, because the answer was always the same. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Don't worry, it's handled. Now imagine that same man staring at his phone, refreshing, waiting, calling again, and again. Nothing. No reply. No transfer. No intermediary stepping in to smooth things over. Just silence. Tonight's story is not really about money. It's not even about jail, lawsuits, or rumors of a bailout that never came. It's about something far more terrifying to someone who has never truly lived without protection. Isolation. And the question no one wants to ask out loud is this: how does a prince react when he finally realizes the safety net is gone? Because according to explosive reports, King Charles did not just refuse to pay an alleged $100 million bailout. He did something far colder, far more final. He cut contact. If that sounds unbelievable, ask yourself this. Why would a king, a father, a man known for patience and restraint, draw such a hard line now? Why not earlier? Why not quietly handle it the way the palace always has? And why does this moment feel different from every scandal, every fallout, every so-called breaking point before it? Here's the uncomfortable truth. This story matters now because it signals a shift that cannot be undone. For years, the public has been told a simple narrative: a misunderstood prince, a cruel institution, a man fighting for his family, his wife, his truth. But behind that narrative, something else was happening quietly, methodically, and with growing urgency. Tolerance was running out. And when tolerance disappears inside a monarchy, consequences follow. Think about it. Institutions don't explode. They close ranks. They withdraw. They protect themselves. And they let individuals fall away if those individuals become liabilities instead of assets. So when rumors began circulating about a massive financial demand, whispered figures climbing toward 9 digits, insiders weren't shocked by the number. They were shocked by the response. No bailout. No emergency intervention. No discreet financial maneuvering behind palace walls. Just a refusal. And then something even more chilling. Blocked access. No direct contact. No father-to-son conversations to soften the blow. If you're wondering whether this could really happen, whether a king would truly shut down communication with his own child, ask yourself another question. What would have to happen for you to do the same? Because people don't cut ties lightly. Especially not in families where image, legacy, and continuity are everything. Especially not when the world is watching. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't rage. It wasn't punishment. It was strategy. And that's what makes this moment dangerous. When emotion drives decisions, people hesitate. They reconsider. They regret. But when strategy takes over, there is no room for sentimentality. Only outcomes. The first thing you need to understand is this. The monarchy does not operate like a normal family. Love exists, yes. So does history, shared grief, shared memory. But above all else, there is a brutal understanding that the institution must survive individual choices. Always. And in this case, someone crossed a line that could no longer be quietly erased. The public heard whispers about lawsuits, about legal battles, about security disputes. But what most people never consider is how quickly legal warfare drains resources, patience, and goodwill behind the scenes. Every filing, every appeal, every public statement, they add up, not just in money, but in credibility. At some point, someone inside the palace asked a question that had been avoided for years. How long do we keep paying for this? And more importantly, what precedent does it set if we don't stop? Because once a prince learns that no matter what he does, someone else will always foot the bill, accountability disappears. And when accountability disappears, behavior escalates. That's where this story turns dark. Reports suggest the alleged bailout request wasn't framed as a favor. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't desperation expressed with humility. It was expectation. An assumption that no matter how strained things had become, the crown would step in. It always had before. But something had changed. The tone was wrong. The timing was worse. And the patience was gone. This is where people misunderstand King Charles. They mistake his quiet nature for weakness. They assume restraint means avoidance. But restraint, when it finally breaks, does not crack loudly. It closes doors. And once those doors close, they do not reopen easily. Now add another layer to this. Timing. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during a period of intense pressure on the monarchy, health concerns, public scrutiny, a constant need to project stability and control. The last thing the institution could afford was another unpredictable variable. And unpredictability is poison to monarchy. That's why this alleged refusal matters so much. It wasn't about money. It was about boundaries. About signaling that the era of unconditional support was over. And then came the silence. No calls returned. No direct access. No private explanations. If you've ever been cut off by someone you expected to always be there, you know how destabilizing that feels. Now imagine that person is not just your father, but the final authority over an institution that once defined your identity. What do you become when that identity is revoked? This is where the story takes an even more unsettling turn. Because silence doesn't just hurt emotionally. It forces people into corners. And people in corners make dangerous decisions. That's where whispers of jail, unrest, and instability began creeping into the narrative. Not as confirmed outcomes, but as fears, warnings, signals of how far things could spiral without intervention. One phrase, repeated in hushed tones, sent shockwaves through insiders. You will riot in jail. Was it literal? Metaphorical? A warning about public reaction or personal collapse? No one knows for sure. And that ambiguity is intentional. Because the fear wasn't about incarceration itself. It was about what happens when someone who has never been told no is suddenly faced with consequences he cannot control. When the shield disappears. When the name no longer opens doors. When the safety net is removed. That's when panic sets in. And panic leads to miscalculations. This introduction isn't here to condemn or defend. It's here to show you something most people miss. Power is not lost in one dramatic moment. It erodes, quietly, incrementally, until one day, you realize it's gone. The tragedy isn't that a bailout was refused. The tragedy is that the refusal revealed something far worse. There was nothing left to leverage. No goodwill. No institutional obligation. No emotional override. Just distance. And distance inside a royal family is not accidental. It's deliberate. So before we talk about lawsuits, jail rumors, public backlash, or future fallout, we need to rewind. We need to understand how a prince once described as the most protected man in Britain slowly dismantled the very system that protected him. Because this didn't begin with a $100 million demand. It began years earlier, with a belief that the crown would always bend. And the moment it stopped bending, everything changed. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to a time when Harry could do no wrong. When mistakes were smoothed over. When consequences were absorbed by others. Because the fall is never shocking unless you understand how high the climb once was. And once you see that climb, the refusal makes chilling sense. Imagine being born into a life where mistakes are forgiven before anyone even notices. Every action analyzed, every word dissected, yet somehow, no matter what happens, the system bends to protect you. That was Harry's world once. A prince shielded by palace walls, by lawyers, by PR teams trained to control every narrative. A world where the word wrong didn't truly apply to you. It applied only to the outside world, the critics, the press, the gossip columns. It's hard for most people to grasp what that feels like. Your mistakes aren't punished, they're managed. If a misstep becomes public, the palace whispers, smooths it over, and spins it back into a story that preserves your image. Every family disagreement becomes a private conversation. Every error becomes an anecdote recast as charm or rebellion. There is safety in predictability, power in invisibility. And for Harry, that safety net was never questioned. Until it was. Think about the privileges that came naturally. Palace staff who anticipated your needs before you even voiced them, security that could literally move mountains, and a global media machine that both idolized and feared you. Harry lived in a world where doors opened at a glance, and any threat, real or imagined, was neutralized quickly. The public only ever saw the polished veneer. What they didn't see was the network working tirelessly behind the scenes. The advisors, the legal teams, the senior staff, the careful choreography of appearances and statements, all designed to ensure nothing truly harmful ever reached him. But the veneer hides tension. The constant shield can't protect against isolation. While everyone else bows, the protected figure sometimes wonders whether anyone sees him as a person. And the higher the protection, the more severe the consequences when it disappears. For Harry, that moment would come later. But the seeds were sown in the privilege that surrounded him. Even as a child, the rules of royal life taught obedience, discretion, and performance. You could misbehave in private and be forgiven in public. You could push boundaries, but the walls would bend to contain the chaos. That was the first lesson of power. It is not fragile. It survives the mistakes of those it protects. And yet, even in this protected environment, cracks can appear. For Harry, the early cracks were subtle. Offhand remarks, minor rebellions, curiosity about life beyond the palace. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be managed. But every institution, no matter how carefully designed, has its limits. And every shield, no matter how strong, has gaps. By the time Harry reached adulthood, he had experienced enough public scrutiny to understand the stakes. He knew cameras would follow, headlines would spin, and whispers would become narratives. Yet he also knew that the system would intervene if anything truly dangerous arose. He learned to operate within the paradox of royal life, the freedom to rebel, bounded by invisible but unbreakable constraints. It's easy to imagine that living under constant supervision breeds complacency. To some degree, it does. But it also teaches cunning, strategy, and the art of negotiation. Harry learned early that influence and power are less about force and more about timing, perception, and leverage. Every word he spoke, every action he took, could be amplified or contained depending on how the palace chose to act. And in that environment, mistakes aren't just forgiven. They're often exploited for future lessons. A poorly chosen word in public becomes an example for future protocol. A reckless action in private becomes an anecdote, shaping the next generation's understanding of risk. This was Harry's playground and his classroom at once. He could push, test limits, and experiment, knowing that consequences would be calculated and mediated. But the problem with being untouchable is that you forget the rules apply to everyone else, too. When someone operates in a world where mistakes are corrected automatically, there's a risk that the world outside will not be so forgiving. That lesson would come later, and it would come hard. Even within the palace, loyalty is conditional. Staff may appear devoted, but their devotion is measured against hierarchy, reputation, and risk. Advisors shielded Harry, yes, but they also monitored, reported, and advised. The palace is a system built for survival, not sentimentality. When survival is threatened, the system doesn't flinch, it recalibrates. And for Harry, the first lessons in recalibration were subtle but unmistakable. Take, for example, media incidents that were handled before they became crises. Stories about youthful indiscretions were contained. Leaks were intercepted. The narrative was controlled. In public, Harry appeared almost untouchable, charismatic, and charmingly rebellious. Yet in private, every move was subtly guided to avoid catastrophe. He could make headlines, but he could not make irreversible mistakes, at least, not while the shield was intact. It's in these small moments that power is revealed. Not through wealth, not through title, but through the simple act of being untouchable. Harry's world functioned like a finely tuned machine. Actions corrected, risks mitigated, public perception managed. It was a life most people could only dream of. And yet, paradoxically, it created a blind spot. One day, Harry would discover that what protects you can also trap you. Because the higher you are, the further you fall. Every privilege carries weight. Every immunity carries consequence. And every layer of protection is also a layer of expectation. The palace shielded Harry not only to protect him, but to maintain the image of the monarchy itself. His mistakes weren't just personal, they were symbolic. And every time the system intervened, it sent a clear signal. You are part of this institution, and your freedom is conditional. At the same time, Harry's position afforded him opportunities few can imagine. Doors that would remain closed for ordinary people swung open. Access to global networks, influential figures, and confidential resources allowed him a sphere of influence beyond his years. Yet power, when insulated, can also distort reality. One can believe that influence equals control, that visibility equals freedom, and that reputation is something you can always manage. And that distortion can be dangerous. It fosters assumptions. It fuels expectations. It creates a mindset where you believe the system exists solely to support you, not to constrain you. For years, Harry's life operated on this assumption. He could make choices, challenge expectations, and still rely on the system to step in when consequences loomed. A public misstep? Managed. A personal crisis? Contained. A financial challenge? Covered. This wasn't luck, it was design. The palace exists to protect its own, but it also exists to maintain control. The paradox is that control often feels like freedom to those it shields. But freedom, real freedom, is never granted, it's earned. And Harry, for all his privilege, had never faced a moment where the shield could not absorb the impact. That moment would come, as all moments come, unannounced and unforgiving. Because even the most carefully managed lives encounter moments where the rules of the system no longer apply. Moments when personal choice collides with institutional necessity. Moments when expectation meets refusal. And that is where Harry's story truly begins. Not with scandal, not with media leaks, not with lawsuits, but with the quiet realization that the system that once been around him could no longer do so. In that world, where the palace once caught every fall, no one was there. Every previously untouchable safety net had been retracted. And for someone who had never known what it was like to operate without protection, the impact was seismic. If you think about it, this is the cruelest twist of all. A life built around being untouchable, now facing a moment where touch could bring consequence. The very tools that elevated him, privilege, protection, influence, now offer no defense. They provide no comfort. They exist only as reminders of what he once had and what he is about to lose.